Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary Salt.
And I'm Sebastian Moore.
And today we are joined by Tom Slater. Hello, Tom.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Editor of Spiked Online, which is an online magazine I think most of our listeners and viewers will be familiar with. Thanks for joining us. Really pleased to have you. Do you want to maybe just start off by telling people who maybe don't know a little bit about Spiked?
No, absolutely. So Spiked, we say we're the magazine that wants to change the world as well as report on it. We've been around for 25 years now. We just recently celebrated our anniversary. And for us, writing and journalism is really about pushing the ideas that we think are important, particularly freedom of speech, fundamentally, which is such a perennial issue these days, which I know we're going to get into a little bit. Democracy, which is part of the reason we were such passionate Brexiteers, but also very stridently believe in the fact that the point of politics is to make sure that ordinary people are empowered to make decisions about their own lives, about the nations in which they live. And also the kind of project of essentially kind of human endeavor, material abundance, the point of politics being to improve people's lives and to make sure that people have a greater standard of living, and that not only us as nations but us as a species can continue to thrive. So all of these ideas, you'll notice, are quite unfashionable amongst many sections of particularly the left these days, though not exclusively. But for all of our 25 years, it's really been about pushing those core three principles, I would say.
And I think a lot of things that you've said there would kind of fall into what you might call traditional left. But I think that there's also, and what strikes me when I read Spike now, and I've been an avid reader for those 25 years, I would say, there's a lot more diverse voices now than maybe there were at one point, and some of those voices are perhaps people who traditionally wouldn't have been associated with the left. Do you ever kind of worry that you maybe have come a long way and perhaps too far away from your roots?
Of course, I wouldn't like to say so. I would like to think so. And I actually think that because of the fact that our kind of positions on the issues we were just talking about, but just politics in general, are so clearly established, people who know about us know where we stand on issues. And I think it's actually our consistency, which is one of the things that people appreciate, that they know we're not going to fold just because of where the kind of intellectual currents are moving, or because someone on our own side is being censored, or whatever it might be. They know we're going to be very consistent on those points. I also think that as we've grown and as we've been able to develop this sort of roster of people, new writers or very established writers who I'm very proud to say are now writing for us, Julie Birchall, Lionel Shriver, there's people from the left, there's people from the right, there's libertarians, there's kind of more old school socialists. I think the reason that Spiked has become a natural home for them is because even though we might come from slightly different traditions, even though we might have slightly different ways that we get to a particular point, we come to the same conclusion for slightly different reasons a lot of the time. And in this sort of time where left and right are not as clearly defined as they used to be, in which a lot of things that used to mean being on the left are kind of the inverse now, and kind of the same for the right in some respects as well. I think that's quite a fruitful place to be. I think we're all kind of in search of a new sort of synthesis, or a new set of clear-cut issues that we can all cohere around. And that's why I think it is both an interesting, exciting, quite productive thing to be able to be that kind of one of many publications and organizations which are kind of a hub for various different voices, as well as having a core identity of its own, if that makes sense.
So this is, as you say, it's something that it seems to be constantly on the agenda, this idea of left and right. Does it exist anymore? I know that you, Hilary, have said that you feel like we're living in a pre-political time.
Yeah.
And if we are, and I feel like at a time when we struggle to agree on anything, when it feels like everybody can disagree with the most sort of obvious common sense point, there is something that seems to cut across the political spectrum, which is this idea that we are living in a strange time. I think everybody sort of can feel that and understand it. And without sort of, I know you haven't got a crystal ball, but where do you see this going, and what do you see your role in that being? Do you think we can sort of push through this into a more a political landscape that makes a little bit more sense?
Oh no, absolutely. I think whilst it is a very disorientating political era in so many ways, not only because just the way things feel like they're kind of coming apart, we could talk about that domestically and socially. We could talk about that internationally in terms of the kind of geopolitical order that everyone, I say everyone, some people thought was going to hold forever is disintegrating incredibly quickly, and the way in which a lot of kind of quite damaging establishment orthodoxies are now colliding with reality, demonstrating how damaging they've been kind of all at once, whether we're talking about environmentalism, whether we're talking about some of the insane institutionalized identity politics and multiculturalism. We're sort of at a point where you've got kind of omni-crisis is one of the kind of buzzwords that is often used, and I think that does say something. But the way through it, I think, is always those core issues. It's freedom of speech, excuse me, it's democracy. I think we live in an era in which the elites have lost their minds, and therefore empowering ordinary people to push back against those manias has become more important than ever. So whilst it's not clear what form this is going to take, what political movements it might produce, what future governments it might produce, what labels we might be attaching to ourselves in 10 or 15 years hence. Excuse me. It's quite clear that the dividing lines are over democracy. They're over the questions of sovereignty. They're over the questions of freedom of speech. They're over the questions of whether or not we should put something in the abstract like saving the planet over people being able to improve their own lives and enjoy a kind of higher standard of living. Those things are pretty clear cut. You sense that in a lot of the political debates, and therefore I think those are the lines which are being drawn. They're not traditionally left or traditionally right in the way that we might have understood them previously. But at the same time, it's quite clear that if we're going to get our way through this, it's definitely through fighting for freedom of speech and fighting for democracy, particularly at a point when I think the establishment have proven themselves to not just be wrong, but to be incredibly authoritarian in their wrongness, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So can I just briefly mention your talk at the Battle of Ideas last year? So I remember you were on a panel that was discussing polarization. And I spoke to you, I think, the night before and said, oh, it really worries me. I feel like this is something I see in my own life, family members being pulled apart by these political topics. And you said, oh, I'm going to speak in favor of polarization. And you kind of made the point that for too long we've been force-fed these unhinged ideas by a subsection of the population, and the polarization is a result of sort of the normal person pushing back.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think it's really interesting when people use the phrase polarization. It's rarely often used in relation to members of the establishment coming out with incredibly extreme ideas and forcing them down our throats. That's just seen as the normal business of politics, whether we're talking about immigration or gender or whatever it is. And yet, as soon as people just push back even lightly and say, hang on a minute, surely you can't have men in women's sports. Surely we can't allow for the small boats crisis to carry on the way that it is. Then they're presented as waging a culture war, being incredibly polarizing, being unnecessarily hot-headed. So there's clearly something amiss in terms of how this word is used. But on the more substantive point about polarization is politics to a certain extent. It's about taking sides on issues that matter. The point in which American politics, for instance, became very polarized was in the course of the civil rights movement. That was an important political battle which had to be had. Are Black American citizens or are they not? That's a point in which you have to take a side. And we've seen that on a different scale and in a different context in the UK. You take something like Brexit, that's a point in which you have to say, are we in favour of democracy and sovereignty, or are we in favour of this supranational clique running all of our lives? I don't think we should shy away from taking sides from division in that sense. Where I think things can get unnecessarily testy is when you're polarized around issues that just genuinely don't matter, which genuinely don't have any impact. But I think a lot of the things that we are talking about really do matter. The question of borders matters. The question of democracy matters. The question of the culture war matters because it has a material impact on people's lives, their rights, their ability to speak their minds. So polarization is politics to a certain extent. It is about taking sides. We call it division, the divisions in the House of Commons for a reason, because there are supposedly two sides of an argument, and there's something quite productive when you let those things clash. So even though it's a bit of a lonely stance to take, I think in a way we need more polarization, not less, in some respects.
I guess the kind of counter to that is that certainly for us, what we're trying to do is develop long-term policy for a kind of political party. A lot of those issues are not black and white, So I mean, even immigration. I think, you know, everybody can say we absolutely oppose illegal immigration, but as soon as you start talking about legal immigration, you can say, yes, we're against mass immigration, but what does that mean? You can say, you know, we might be open to small amounts of skilled immigration. What does that mean? And some of those things are really hard. Those discussions are hard to have in a really polarized situation where people just want to take one side or the other.
Oh no, absolutely. I think I suppose there's always a distinction to be made about things that are really points of principle and things that are points of policy, where you do want to talk about trade-offs, where you do want to talk about what is the correct thing to pursue for society, for the economy. I think most people recognize that. And I think part of the problem is because of the fact that a lot of these policy decisions have been insulated from democratic control,
Yeah.
from political debate. That you take something like the immigration issue, the way in which that was either just not talked about or dissenting voices were shouted down and sort of smeared for so long, it has a tendency to inflame positions to a certain extent. Not for everyone. I think a lot of people are pretty reasonable on many of these questions, even if they have quite firm views. But it's precisely, I think, if you want to have that kind of much more productive discussion, that democratizing the debate is so important. Yes, there'll be certain things that people don't want to budge on as a point of principle. Politics is not just the world of consensus building, because I think that can often lead to ordinary people being shut out and policies just being kind of stitched up amongst a quite small number of political players. But at the same time, it's precisely by putting those things back in the democratic arena where we can argue about them, sometimes testily, that you can figure out a way through these things. So I think it's that, for me, it's that distinction. There are certain principles which are really important, which do cut across, which do invite people to take a side, and rightly so. But it's through actually, you know, it's through embracing kind of proper politics and democratic debate that you can find a kind of sensible way through these things, I suppose.
Yeah.
I completely share your sentiment there, but I don't know if we see it playing out, and I worry that, I mean, you take something like this Online Safety Act that's been in the news this last couple of days, and I feel like that's the sort of thing we should be having a proper political debate about, right? This is quite complicated stuff that I don't fully understand, and that's the sort of thing that should be out there in the public realm so that we can really get into the issue. And what you have instead is somebody comes out against it, like Nigel Farage and Reform, and then the Labour Party, Peter Kyle, I can't think what he is, Science Technology Minister, says, well, in that case, Nigel Farage is on the side of predators, right? And you think this is the side, you know, he's representing the side that has sort of rallied against the divisive political dialogue, I feel it's incredibly hypocritical at a time when I think it's needed more than ever for us to really have sensible adult conversations about these things.
And I think Peter Kyle and his absurd, Nigel Farage, Jimmy Savile smear is a really good example of how the sort of establishment centrists, the adults in the room, kind of pick your cliche, that we were told had returned to power and that therefore we could all breathe a sigh of relief because they do politics in a much more sophisticated fashion, are as given, if not more so, to hysteria than any other section of politics. I mean, someone challenges online safety bill, this kind of enormous, broad sweeping. I think even the people who drew it up don't really understand it and what its consequences might be. So you're not alone there, Sebastian. Kind of piece of legislation which is already having a serious kind of impact on our ability to share information and debate things in the sort of digital public square. As soon as someone challenges that, all you get is shrieking and baseless allegations that they're on the side of sexual predators. And you see that with all kinds of different issues. The way in which the gender issue, which obviously is very bound up with Labour, even though the Tories were responsible for pushing through a lot of those policy changes, or at least attempting to during their time in power. That was very much a kind of internal argument within the Labour Party. You had trenchant left-wing feminists under the Labour umbrella trying to quite reasonably raise concerns for a number of years, and yet they were treated as if they were sort of Nazi entryist pretty explicitly by broad sections of the Labour Party, and then the leadership of that party just sort of turned a blind eye to that demonisation. So it's a reminder that in this time, which we're told that there are these people called the populists and the culture warriors who are lowering the tone of debate, who are polarizing things and whatever. I really think it's coming predominantly in one direction, which is from a sort of establishment which has come under sustained attack because of its policies being so authoritarian, being so anti-democratic, just being wrong-headed in one way, shape or form. And because they increasingly don't really know what they think, because a lot of them are quite unimpressive in many respects. And also I think because they recognize that they're out of touch, that they can't really command the support of a lot of the electorate, they lash out in an increasingly hysterical fashion. So I think that's part of what we're seeing play out with this with this Peter Kyle debate. Yes, it's kind of political mudslinging in the way that you're always going to have, but I think it does speak to something broader with a technocratic political class which can't convince anyone, so it constantly has to compel them to do things, and also has become authoritarian, but in a kind of very brittle fashion. It's kind of it's hard on the outside precisely because it's so weak in so many respects.
And just with your journalist hat on, can you just tell us what your view is of the Online Safety Act? Is it a real problem in the sphere of journalism?
Potentially, I mean, probably the primary thing that we've seen play out since these age verification checks came through is just in terms of the free flow of information, generally speaking. The fact that you've seen even speeches by Conservative MPs about the grooming gangs being censored because people haven't logged in and given Elon Musk their passport details. The fact that you're seeing just footage from some of the protests which have been going on around the country also being kind of acid washed from people's social media feeds. That's obviously the primary issue, and that affects everyone, not just journalists. But at the same time, in a kind of era in which social media is so important to journalism, in which we have citizen journalism becoming an increasingly prominent thing, that's a huge problem in and of itself. Social media is a way in which a lot of people get their news these days, and whilst it might be tempting to lament that, that's also just the way things are going. So that's a clear-cut problem. There are these carve-outs within the Online Safety Act that are supposedly to protect what they deem to be essentially kind of legitimate media publications. If you meet a certain set of criteria, supposedly the big tech companies, for instance, are supposed to put things in place to ensure that they're not needlessly removing or taking down or otherwise obscuring material which is journalistic, which is supposed to be there to inform the public. There's also protections that we're supposed to enjoy around kind of below the line commenting and so on, because the comments under an article are not the same as a social media platform. They're not obviously analogous. But on the one hand, we've got to see how these things play out. I mean, a lot of these effects weren't even necessarily predicted when these new age verification rules were going to come in. There was a funny article in Politico the other day saying that these new rules are going to come in. Will anyone notice? And of course, we all noticed absolutely instantly.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
and also it does raise awkward questions as to who is supposed to decide what a legitimate media publication is, rather than someone who might just be a very talented and very skilled blogger. So we'll find out, I suppose. But what I'm particularly concerned about, I suppose, is the combination of this piece of legislation and just the other suite of censorious things this government are obviously interested in doing. Reviving press regulation, more clampdowns on freedom of speech, which obviously affect journalism as much as they affect anyone else. And I think it's a combination of all of those things which makes it feel bleak, not just for everyone's ability to express themselves, but obviously journalists in particular, as the kind of practical expression and form of freedom of speech that we represent in some respects.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's double think, isn't it? It's like these rules are really important. They're going to protect kids. It's super important that we get this issue passed, but you won't notice it, don't worry.
Absolutely.
Indeed, yeah. Tom, you wrote an article, I think it's earlier this week, about the kind of idea of Tinderbox Britain. We had an internal meeting earlier this week where one of our colleagues said, we are one hot evening away from revolution almost. Is that right? Do you get that feeling that we are, teetering on the edge?
Let's just say he wasn't fantasizing about
No, he was worried about that.
He's worried.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is worth saying that, because there's some sections, I suppose, of the sort of crankier end of the right who are talking up civil war with a certain amount of relish.
Yeah.
You can't help but detect at the moment, which is certainly something that no one should be relishing the prospect of. I mean, it's quite clear that things are coming apart. I think that what we saw, both in terms of the protests, largely peaceful, but not exclusively, outside of migrant hotels that we've seen recently, and also now that we're marking a year anniversary since the Southport massacre, but also the year anniversary of the post-Southport riots, in which you saw, alongside, again, people trying to mount peaceful protests, just a lot of straightforwardly racist, anti-migrant violence, attempts to burn down migrant hotels, smashing windows in migrant areas, screaming racial slurs. This stuff is, we ignore it at our peril.
Yeah.
I think it's important not to catastrophize about these things, not to pretend like this represents, certainly the violent, bigoted end of this represents anything like a more mainstream sentiment. I don't think any opinion poll would stack that up. But I think it does point to a kind of broader context in which, precisely because some of the core issues around illegal immigration, social cohesion, multiculturalism, twinned with a kind of decaying economy and social realm, because those things haven't been addressed, it does unfortunately create the space for something darker and more extreme to curdle at the edges. That's sort of inevitable. So to try and explain and contextualize what's going on is not to excuse it, nor to relish in it, nor to think there's anything positive about it. But I think we're at a point now where we really need to address the various ways in which it feels like we're coming apart. And incidentally, I think it's not just those horrific riots last year, which have naturally kind of taken most of the discussion up because of how widespread they were and for how long they raged. But other things that we've seen in recent years, the 2022 riots in Leicester, where you had kind of Hindu and Muslim youths knocking lumps out of each other after things sparked off after a India-Pakistan cricket match, or the Hare Hills riot in Leeds, which was about 11 days, I think, before the Southport massacre, where you saw that very deprived, largely foreign-born, very diverse community go up in flames after the social services tried to take some Roma children into care. So in kind of so many different ways, you see that sense of community cohesion, that sense of togetherness just sort of fraying. And whilst these extreme moments of horrific, despicable violence don't come anywhere close to defining a broader public mood, they're clearly symptoms of something that needs to be addressed.
And do you have some solutions for that? Well, how do we address that? I guess you might say, how does government address that? But also, Kat, but I guess more widely, how do we start kind of building more social cohesion?
No, absolutely, because it's clearly a combination of so many different factors that have got us to this particular point. I think it's not just migration per se, but I think it's the combination of mass migration, uncontrolled illegal immigration, and multiculturalism, which is a really toxic mix. And I think we're starting to see that, not only opening one's doors, as it were, to newcomers, but also to do those things in a completely unvetted fashion in so many respects, and also bringing them into a society which is not particularly interested in integrating them, which has a kind of political establishment and a state which is actually kind of slightly sniffy about the idea of Britain being a good place at all. And I think you put all those things together, the tendency to treat patriotism or a sense of just national identity in general as something at best quaint, at worst sort of jingoistic, I think is again very toxic, because precisely it's those kinds of broader national identity debates which could actually bind people of different backgrounds together. That should surely be the point. You also have just the way in which there's been so much distrust which has been sown by the rise of what's often called two-tier policing, political correctness within the state more broadly, leading to things like the horrendous grooming gangs cover up. There's so much that we need to kind of unpick here, that we need to just introduce some pretty commonsensical policies to try to start to address. And I also think it's important that those people who are engaged in politics also push back against the increasingly divisive and extreme solutions which are being pushed in certain quarters. There is a retreat into a kind of ethnic politics that you're starting to see around the edges. I mean, this is largely amongst a bunch of influencers who the vast majority of people would never even heard of, even if they've got quite big feeds on X these days. But nevertheless, I think that indicates a certain unpleasant way that these things can turn. So I think it's about addressing a lot of the policy failures, obviously, but also making sure that we push back and recognize the sort of ugly reactionary shortcuts that some people are trying to take to what are quite important, profound questions that we're confronted with.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this idea of having debates about the national identity, or our national identities can actually bind us together. And something we often talk about is this idea of, I think this is kind of why we exist really as a political party, because we're pursuing this idea of rebuilding the nation. We accept the fact that we can't go back. That UK that we once had is gone, and we have to push forward towards a better vision of the country. And the idea of rebuilding the nation is not just a worthwhile endeavour in itself. The actual pursuit of that will force us to come together and to have these debates, and that will actually be us communing to do something rather than just, arguing all the time.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think you make a really important point about how you can't go back entirely. I mean, there's a sort of mix. Sometimes there's a kind of slightly sepia tone nostalgia, or more recently, a kind of recourse to, you're not properly British if you don't know who Alfred the Great is. This sort of discourse which has cropped up for recent days, even though the vast majority of anyone who's gone through certainly the state education system would probably have no idea who Alfred the Great is, whether you want to lament that fact or not. And it's quite clear that what we need to do is, again, kind of push forward together to have a kind of understanding of where we've been, but also where we're going. And it reminds me of a point. I mean, you must have given this being the SDP's podcast, and I imagine George Orwell was quoted ad nauseum in terms of these questions of nationhood and whatnot. But it's a point that he made quite powerfully, which is that patriotism is in essence not a conservative project because it's something that's always changing. You do have to embrace that to a certain extent. You don't have to. That's not to say that what it means to be British or what it means to be a citizen of this country is something which is purely about kind of abstract, deracinated values about kumbaya or whatever. There can be some real historical, cultural, and political substance to that. Yeah. But at the same time, it's something which is necessarily about bringing people together in the here and now to carve out a nation and a sense of community together, which is something that is often missing in this debate, I suppose.
So I love your motto at Spikes that you mentioned at the start of the show, that the magazine that wants to change the world as well as report on it. Just on a personal level, how do you want to change the world?
Well, without wanting to keep repeating myself, I think one thing that we've been quite instrumental in, without patting ourselves too much on the back, is really bringing these questions about freedom of speech and democracy back to the core. I think those in so many ways are the through lines of so many things that ail us because of the reasons that we've talked about, because we have, broadly speaking, a public who remain pretty commonsensical, got their heads screwed on, know what it is they want from life, but they're lumbered with a political establishment which has gone crazy. And who are trying to force feed all kinds of divisive and damaging policies down the nation's throat. Similarly, with freedom of speech, this is an issue that we've been talking about for a very long time, whether it was in terms of the general kind of cultural turn against freedom of speech, the way in which there was this culture of you can't say that, as our launch editor Mick Hume would describe it, what we now kind of see as kind of cancel culture and whatnot, but also the legal turn, the way in which that we have in this country, but across Europe as well, been engaged in this sort of 50, 60-year project now of trying to police hate, offence, increasingly misinformation, as if you could define any of those terms particularly objectively. And that's also a real block, not just to protecting freedom of speech in the abstract as a sort of liberty that we enjoy and that we see as important, but also as a means through which you change the world around you. So one thing about freedom of speech that is often missed, it's a very kind of radical proposition insofar as it's not only saying that everyone should have the right to express themselves, which is something that vanishingly few people in history have been able to fully enjoy, but also that it's through that process that you can push society forward, that you can challenge backwards ways that you want to dispense with, and also carve out a more interesting, fulfilling future. And so even though that can sound a little bit like going back to first principles or whatnot and talking a bit more in the abstract, I do think it's through those two issues in particular, free speech and democracy, that any change is possible, certainly any positive change we might want to carve out.
I guess the other thing you might, if you're being a bit more commercial, Tom, you might say you want to grow the membership and encourage people to read the website. We'll definitely put a link in the show notes and subscribe to the website. Do you have anything else that you're planning in the short term that you want to tell people about?
Well, at the moment, because as you say, it's all about making sure that we can grow the magazine, that we can grow the YouTube channel, that we can keep getting our message out there in so many different ways. Because I think the media at the moment and politics is about, there's so many, to be involved now is to be a kind of, every media organization is kind of a multimedia organization now. That's very keen on pursuing. I bump into people all the time who might think we're exclusively a YouTube channel, or might think that we're exclusively a social media feed or whatever. And that is something to be embraced rather than resolved from in so many respects. Two big things we're focusing on at the moment, one of which is getting back into making long form documentaries. We've got a few in the pipeline. I don't want to announce them just yet necessarily, but that's something that we've done historically. We made a couple of really successful docs about first Brexit and then the kind of post-Brexit, post-Trump moment, a film called Deplorables, which got about 900,000 views on YouTube, which is our sort of attempt to, in a bit more depth, but in the kind of YouTube visual medium, get across our ideas and look at the moment that we live in. And also more books. Recent years, we've been publishing kind of series of books by some of our authors, particularly Brendan O'Neill, our chief political writer, as well as Joanna Williams. We've got a few more of those in the pipeline which we're hoping to bring out. So aside from the magazine and aside from the daily kind of and weekly podcasts and whatnot, that's something that we're quite keen to pursue in the near term to keep getting the message out there in a bit more depth, I suppose.
Great.
I thought you might announce some of these documentaries that are in the works, and we were excitingly close to a Take Me Home exclusive for a quick second.
Very soon, I promise. Next, when I'm cleared to announce it, I'll obviously do that here.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm very old-fashioned because I go to the website, and as you say, I'm sure a lot of people do go to the YouTube
I'm
channel.
on the YouTube.
Yeah, I was telling Sebastian about your article, your kind of Tinderbox article, and he said, "Oh, is it on YouTube?" And I said, "No, it's an
It actually is,
article."
funny enough. Yeah.
It is. I watched it on YouTube. You read it online.
Yeah, no, but that's one thing you've got to kind of double up these days. So as to
Yes, yeah,
read.
yeah, great, okay. So, Sebastian, I think you are bringing something to Culture Club this week,
I
aren't
do.
you?
We always have this joke that I don't often bring things to Culture Club, so I'm trying to get out there and do some more things. But at the weekend, I went to the Eden Project.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, which I'd been to as a kid, probably when I was about 11 years old. I
Yeah.
hadn't been to since. I'm a bit of a cheapskate, and I found out that if you do the ParkRun, which is
Yes.
at the Eden Project,
Ah.
on a Saturday morning, you can get in for free.
Wow.
And you
And
save.
is the park run around the Eden Project?
It is.
Oh,
It's
how
awesome.
fantastic.
I'd
Oh, I must
so
do that
recommend
one.
it. You really have to.
Yeah.
And it's £38 to get into the Eden Project, which is a fortune. So I said it's the first time in my life that I've been paid to run.
Okay,
Right?
yeah.
And I've got a bad back, but I thought if I can do this in 20 minutes, then what is that, about 90, well, over 100 quid an hour I'm worth
Do you do a
as an
5K
athlete.
in 20 minutes?
Not at the weekend.
Okay, I was going to say.
When
that's
I'm
fast.
fit, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, so it starts outside, and they say you're not coming back to this point because you're going to go into the Eden Project before it opens.
Okay.
And I think it's the only net negative, as in net downhill, a park run that I've ever done. Because it starts at the top, and then you run down. The Eden Project is situated in this crater. And you run down into the Eden Project, do a couple of laps, and then you finish there. So it's a quick park run as well. The Eden Project opened in 2001. And for anybody that doesn't know, it's basically I suppose it's a research project in many ways, but they showcase a lot of the flora from different parts of the world, and they have these biomes, these two massive biomes, one of which I think it's certainly one of the largest indoor rainforests in the world. And they're incredible because you walk in and you do feel like you've been transported to a different part of the world. It's amazing. So they've got the Mediterranean biome and the rainforest biome. Now, I remember as a kid them being incredibly hot. Like you walked in and it felt like a rainforest. Yeah. That wasn't the case. It felt quite chilly. So I don't know if they're having power problems.
Okay.
Or maybe they're cheaping out. But
Maybe they cool it for the run.
Maybe, maybe for the runners.
Yeah.
It revitalised that fascination I have with nature, because I wouldn't say I'm somebody that's particularly in touch with nature. You've got your gardening club.
Yeah.
I don't know much about gardening, but reading about the different plants, and for me, if you really want to grab me, put up a map and say this area represents South Africa, or the sort of the tropical heartlands of Africa. This area represents the Amazon rainforest, because then I'm immediately thinking it through it in a geographical lens, and then everything you see, each of the plants, you think, okay, so this is found in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. So I loved it. I went with my niece and nephew, who are 2 and 4, and they probably enjoyed it on a different level to me.
Yes.
So there's things like a little wooden bridge that crosses over. There's a viewing platform which is new since I went as a kid, which is really high up in the biome. Terrifying to climb these metal stairs to go up, especially if you have any fear of heights. But overall, I'd say thoroughly recommend it. And I know we've talked about ParkRun before on the podcast, so I'm sort of trying to focus more on the Eden Project angle.
Yes,
but if you go, save yourself 38 quid, run it, or even just walk it, and you can get them for free.
Superb. Have you been, Tom?
I haven't. And also, given my kind of lifelong aversion to exercise, I'd have to get saving if I do want to go. Couldn't fail myself with that offer. But no, that was a very good sales pitch for it as well. That sounds great.
Sounds fantastic. I remember when I went to Singapore, they've got 2 massive greenhouses there. And the really weird thing is, because obviously it's so hot there, when you walk into their greenhouses, they're very cool. And they've got things like, British flowers growing, like cornflowers and bluebells and things.
So they have to have a cold greenhouse to keep the British
flora
and fauna in it.
Yeah, it was so weird though, walking into a greenhouse and it being cold.
And we've talked before about the idea that the environmentalism has become something very abstract where people talk about carbon emissions and things that are invisible, and it's all sort of very, it's weird how it's just been completely removed, it feels, from nature. And it was so nice to be just almost like back where I was as a kid, because I felt like I had a very normal upbringing. I think I grew up when times were a bit saner, even just in the 2000s. And it was great just to be learning about different plants and different parts of the world and how they cultivate, even things like deforestation. Right? It feels like we don't really talk about deforestation anymore, but that is an issue for parts of Brazil and the people that are harvesting things from these trees. So it's like, I don't know, it felt like a slightly more saner version of environmentalism as well.
Was it very preachy?
No, it wasn't.
Right, okay,
Which is
that's
quite nice.
interesting. Yeah.
Unless I was oblivious to it.
Yeah, good.
Sort of tuned it out. But yeah, because that's what I'd be worried about. That there would be a kind of cardboard cutout of Greta in every corner with a bird or
rainbow trees.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that sounds fantastic. Tom, did you want to bring something to Culture Club?
Yeah, I've been reading like a lot of sort of satirical comic novels at the moment, like as a bit of a palate cleanser from how bleak I suppose a lot of things are going on at the moment. So I'm going for a big Kurt Vonnegut phase, who maybe knows people as the most famous book being The Slaughterhouse-5. It's about his experience as being a prisoner of war in Dresden during the fire bombings there. But the one I'd recommend, which I just finished, is a book called Cat's Cradle, which even cheerier subject is kind of a meditation on the bomb, but through the means of this substance called Ice 9, which can turn every body of water into ice. But it's very funny and very amusing, and something which, even though if it deals with quite heavy subject matter, is just a very enjoyable thing to read. So I'd recommend that.
Superb. We'll put links to these things in the show notes. Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Tom. Been absolutely fantastic canter through your world. And as I say, we'll point people to Spiked in the show notes. Everybody else, thanks for listening. Do remember to follow us, subscribe to our channel, and recommend us to your friends. And we will see you again next week.
Thanks for listening.